IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Anupam Manur, and with me I have the erudite expert on public finance, Mr. Sarthak Pradhan. And Sarthak is going to inform us, enlighten us about the budget that has just been passed yesterday. We all heard the budget speech by the finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman, and where most of us would have just stopped at that, looked at the headline. Sarthak would dive deep into it, look at every number, every comma, every decimal point to see if it's all right. So lots of pressure on Sarthak to really dig deep and give us a lot of information and insight from the budget. Sarthak, welcome. No pressure.
Yeah, thanks, Anupam. In fact, I also didn't know most of these things that you explained about to me right now. Yeah, but anyway, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, so let's just get started. We'll have a dialogue about just the budget, and since the budget is an interim budget, this podcast is also going to be an interim podcast. As in, we're just going to be looking at some big highlights from the budget. Let me start with one of the things that I normally say, which is a boring budget is a good budget. Okay, and yesterday's budget was an extremely boring, tepid affair. Didn't have a lot of hoo-has in it. It was just quite simple. Probably one of the shortest speeches by Nirmala Sitharaman. If you remember, she broke all kinds of records in the 2019-20 and so on. There was some analysis also. This was 25% of the budget speech in 2019, I think, or something of that sort. So in that sense, it was an easy to follow, quick, simple budget. No big, groundbreaking, earth-shattering kind of announcements.
Yeah.
Right. So to begin with, and that is in itself, according to me, a good thing, because the elections are obviously coming up in India. 2024, the general elections are coming up, and the temptation to have gone overboard, the temptation to announce something big, the temptation to announce populist measures would always have been there. But yet, I think they showed a little bit of restraint in that. And that itself is good news. What do you say?
Yeah, Anupam, I completely agree with you on this. That there were not many. In fact, there was no major announcement, and it was just kind of business as usual. So I agree with you on this completely.
Yeah. So part of that, and I think this is interesting, is that I think a part of that is that they're absolutely confident of returning. As in, if both of us can get out of our comfort zones, being economists, and talk about the politics for a while. For me, this displays that they're absolutely confident that they'll come back. Therefore, this is an interim budget. They don't really have to do any. They didn't feel the need to do any of those big populist announcements. They think they'll swing by easily with all the other things they've done or not done, or whatever it is that they think is working in the political realm, right? But one particular statement stood out, and I want to put it out. Nirmala Sitharaman said that and this is the interim budget, and we will present the detailed budget in July when we are back in power. There was no if, there was no when. It was a statement saying we will come back, and this is what we'll do.
Yeah, it shows the confidence.
Yeah. So, okay, Sarthak, tell me, what was your big takeaways from the budget?
Couple of things. First is the government has been prioritizing on capital expenditure, and it's not that this is the only time they have prioritized. In fact, for the last few years, they have been doing that. The effective capital expenditure has been on the rise. So the budgetary allocation for the upcoming fiscal has been more than the previous last year's allocation, and which was again which was a massive jump from last year's capital expenditure spend, right? So this is what they are prioritizing now. There is a reason, why you should prioritize on capital expenditure, or government should prioritize on capital expenditure. The returns are quite high, but you might not get immediate returns, but the multiplier effect is definitely more. So this is one thing. Apart from
Right.
that, yeah.
Let's dig a little bit deep into that, right? Let's actually just unpack it. So first, infrastructure development. I mean, if we go by the numbers, and I want you to actually cast aspersions. Oh no, if not that, at least question this, right? So first, the announcement by Nirmala was that the outlay increased by 11.1%. I think this was done just so you get nice numbers, because now the outlay is supposed to be 11 lakhs 11,111 crore rupees, right? This amounts to about 3.4% of GDP. So in complete amateurs like me would say this is a big increase, but you're saying that it's already been in the increase, and this year it's not so much, but the real big increase came in 2022. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, if you look at the capital expenditure as the share of total expenditure, right? In 22-23, it was around 25%. Last year, it was 30%, right? So, 5% jump. And this year, I mean, the upcoming fiscal, I mean, yesterday's budget, right? It is around 31.4%, right? So, as compared to previous year, only 1% increase. But last year saw a massive jump, like 25% to 30.4%.
Okay, so that's really the figure to kind of keep in mind, that it is a jump, it is good, but it's not really as much as it was last year, right?
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. The
But
Yeah.
Anupam, one thing I wanted to point out here is, I mean, yeah, even if it is 31.4% and last year it was 30.4% of the total expenditure, right? You might not be eventually spending that much on capital, because the revised estimates are slightly lower, right? And 30.4% was what was expected as per the announcements last year, but you spent around 28.3%. So maybe 2%, 3% here and there will be there, but still it is massive.
Right. Sarthak, I know you did another episode on the budget quite recently, and you would have gone through how do you read a budget and so on. But for anybody who's not listened to that, can you just give me a quick lowdown on what this is? What is the outlay? What is the announcement that is made? And then what is the actual revised estimate? What does that tell us?
Yeah. So when the budget is presented, uh, you get to hear some numbers, right? For this sector, we are going to spend this much amount of money in the upcoming fiscal. For this scheme, we are going to spend this much amount of money. This ministry is going to get this much money. So those announcements are there. These are all outlays. There's the money that is going to be spent. But this money, eventually, what it is supposed to do, right? What are you going to achieve with that money? For instance, let's say you are if the outlay for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan is, let's say, 5,000 crores. I'm just I mean, I don't think this is the exact number, but let's assume that 5,000
Numbers out of the hat. Yeah, sure.
yeah,
No problem.
5,000 crores is the outlay for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. The output for that will be X number of toilets will be constructed, or Y number of community sanitary complexes will be constructed. And outcome can be a village can become open defecation free. Those kind of things can be there. So, at this point of, I mean, this is the difference between outlay, outcome, and output. So what I'm saying is the outlay hasn't changed massively in this year as compared to last year. The major change was last year. And when it comes to the output outcomes, we don't know much because this time, for some reason, the output outcome framework, which is usually released along with the budget, is not there. I don't know what is the reason for this. I also went to the Niti Aayog's DMEO website. They also have a section on it. For the upcoming fiscal, they don't have it.
Right. So okay. I think at least a couple of things to unpack there. One quick question was the output outcome framework, was that done in the previous interim budget, let's say 2019? Or is it generally a factor of, because it's an interim budget, that was not done?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I've not looked at the previous interim budget, but let's say even if it's a interim budget, then also you are having the allocation, the outlays. I mean, you are mentioning the outlays for the entire year, right? You're not mentioning it for the next 2 months or 4 months. That's not the case. And whenever you are having an outlay, it should be on some scientific logical basis. Like if I'm saying on a particular scheme, X amount of money will be spent, then what is the how do you break it down further, right? What all will be done with that X amount of money? How did you arrive at that figure, right? So output outcome should be identified, or else you cannot even arrive at that number ideally.
Correct. What do you expect from that number? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not just money giving out for charity, but you're expecting very concrete uh, both output and outcomes from it, and therefore you have to mention it while you're allocating money. I take
yeah,
that point. So now come back to the revised estimate bit. So you're saying that let's stick to your example. You're saying okay, so the outlay could be something like 5,000 crores for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and a year later, when the next budget is presented, they also present something called a revised estimate. So
yeah,
that tells
yeah.
you how much of that 5,000 crores was actually spent. Is that correct?
Yeah. Actually, or not actually. Next, the revised estimates will not give you the exact number, because the revised estimates are also on the basis of the data that you have got for the first 6 months or so of the year, right? So, at this point of time, you have an estimate. It's not a actual number. You get the actual number for the previous to last year.
Right.
So this budget will have the actual number for 22-23. Will have the revised estimates for 23-24. And
Right.
yeah, so again,
Right.
revised estimates are also not the exact number. It will also, I mean, next year budget you'll get the actual expenditure for 23-24.
Right. So in next year's budget,
Huh.
we'll come to know how much of that 5,000 crores was actually spent. Right. And
Spent.
you're saying in many of these cases, the outlay is these big grand announcements that's done during budget doesn't really translate. I mean, many times not all of that amount is actually dispersed, or even if it is dispersed, not all of that amount is actually used for that purpose.
Used exactly. So I'll give you an example. In fact, the Bharat Abhiyan, right? So Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, you have Grameen as well as urban. When it comes to the Grameen one, for some reason there is consistency, right? I mean, whatever is the last year's outlay, the revised estimates, they are more or less same, and this year's allocation is also more or less same. There is consistency. But when it comes to Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, uh, the allocation was, I think, around 5,000 crores, but the revised estimate is around 2,500 crores, almost like 50% drop. And I don't know what is the reason for this drop, right? And I don't think our cities have become so clean, and that that had we I mean that the ministry was not I mean, it did not need anything to do. I mean, it basically had to not do much. So I don't know.
Right. Okay. Okay. So that happens across the board, you see, right? In many departments,
Yeah,
there's an announcement, but not all of that is used up. So that's
not all of that is used, but then this 50% drop is quite huge, right? Maybe if there is a 20%, not 10, 20%, around 10%, 5% variation, I mean, it's still, I think, under that window which is considered acceptable, right? But for some ministries, some departments, this number is quite high. Another instance is that of housing. There were some big announcements made that we are going to spend some 80,000 crore on housing and all those things, right? And interestingly, last year the allocation was also 79,000 crores. I don't know why the media has picked it up and they're saying, oh, 80,000 crores, 80,000 crores. But last year's budgetary allocation was also 79,000 crores, right? So there was not, if you look at the percentage, there's not much of a difference, right? And on top of that, it is like important to note that last time, 79,000 was the budgetary allocation, but the revised estimates were at 32% lower.
Oh, right. So that's
Some,
quite a big
yeah,
drop.
yeah,
That's quite a big
some
drop.
56 or something like that, 56,000 crores. So 32% dip. That means you're not able to spend money. And why you are not able to spend money, you don't know that. Maybe you could not implement it, you would not contract out things. Yeah. So
And that
the
entire
output.
this will really irritate the people in government, but maybe it's policy paralysis.
Yeah, that can
Which
be,
is
that
something
can be, right? Yeah.
that we keep blaming the previous government for. Okay, that's all interesting. I mean, just because you mentioned housing, I think there was one scheme here which also spoke about housing for all in some form or the other, with the 80,000 crores allocation. Which again, I think round numbers help. If you want to get attention of the media, give round numbers. Don't give 79,000 crores and so on. Maybe that's part of it. But let's a little bit more seriously. I think they were trying to do some version of this American dream, right? So they're saying people are living in rented houses, people are living in slums, etc. We will give you the money to build your own homes, right? So now home ownership. I think the shift has become to home ownership. So it's not just construction of houses, but they're saying, okay, you go and own your own home. Then I don't know if that will actually translate into policies, etc. But I think that in terms of messaging, at least that was part of it. And so I want to head back to and talk about capex. But before we do that, let's just take a quick break, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about infrastructure. We'll talk about fiscal deficit and a whole bunch of other things. So just hold on. We'll return after the break.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Hello, folks. Welcome back. We were just speaking about the American dream, or now the reimagined Indian dream of home ownership. But I want to move on, or rather move back to talking about capital expenditure. And Sarthak was just about, I interrupted him earlier, but we were about to go into this idea of why capex is important and why government spending on capex is also important. So we, again, set this in context. I think many of you would already be familiar, so we don't have to belabor this point, but governments can either take capital expenditure or revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure, for all practical purposes, the amount of money that they have to spend in order to just keep the government running, or in order to repay interest on loans, etc., that they've taken. Basically, that means to say that nothing useful will come out of it, in the sense that we are not creating assets. Okay, we are not creating assets. Whereas in capital expenditure, we are creating assets. So, Sarthak, why is capital expenditure so much important? Why do we always look at that number? What is the return to society on capital expenditure?
So capital expenditure, as opposed to revenue expenditure, is basically that recurring expenditure, right? The money that you spend on salaries, wages, interest payments, all those things. Well, capital expenditure is the money that you spend on building assets, for instance. And you might not get immediate returns on all these things, but you get higher returns maybe at a later point of time. There is a technical term for this, multiplier effect. For instance, if you are building infrastructure, right? Capital expenditure. You're building roads, railways, all these things will give you higher returns. It will be in the range of maybe 3 to 4%, 3 to 4 times, right? If you're spending 1 rupee, the returns will be 3 to 4. And you can
Can I just intervene here very quickly for this thing? So when we say returns on, let's say, railways, it's not really just in terms of ticket collections. And what is the return, right? It just means that building a new, let's say, laying down a new railway line to hitherto unserviced area will increase economic activity by that much more. So that's what we mean by return. So now that just the fact that a railway line has opened up or a new road has opened up, it just means that economic activity will increase by that much. And that's the return to society that we're talking about. Not really in the strict sense of returns in terms of, toll collections or tickets sold. Just to make that clear. Yeah,
exactly.
Sorry.
I mean, just you can think of a Delhi metro, right? How the metro connectivity would have connected parts of Haryana to parts of UP, and how people can seamlessly move from one place to another. And all these things would have helped in economic activity. And just you can think of freight corridors, you can think of highways, how they help in this, right? So yeah, I mean, this is what that is the reason why you need to focus on capital expenditure. So you're looking forward to the future.
So can we try and put some numbers into this? One, let's start with one of our favorite concepts, which is the marginal cost of public funds. So we're saying that every rupee that the government spends, the cost to society of that is 3 rupees. For anyone who's interested to know more about this and why and so on, please read In Service of the Republic by Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar, who goes on to this in detail as to why that is the case, right? But for now, just kind of take this at face value, which is 1 rupee that the government spends actually costs society 3 rupees. Okay, so that is one number you have to keep in mind. The other number that you have to keep in mind is what do we get from that 1 rupee? Now, revenue expenditure by, let's say, by the union government actually gives you just about 40 paisa back in return. By the revenue expenditure by state governments gives you a little bit more, but the highest return is capital expenditure by the union government. Capital expenditure by the union government actually gives you back something like 4 rupees in return. So the cost to society is 3 rupees. The return to society is about 4 rupees. The net kind of return is positive and it's about 1 rupee. And that's the only kind of expenditure by the union government which gives you a positive return. Every other kind of expenditure will give you a negative return. Now, it doesn't mean that we can do away with all other expenditure. You still have to spend on interest payments. You still have to spend on running the government, on salaries and so on. But that we have to try and minimize those things, or rationalize, not even minimize, but maybe rationalize it. Only spend on things that are completely required, whereas you're now, capital expenditure is the things that will give you maximum return. So that's one idea, that if the government has to spend, let it spend on capital expenditure. So that's part of it. And I think we, as Sarthak mentioned, we've been increasing capital expenditure, and even in this budget, it kind of sticks to that. Sarthak, let's move on from capital expenditure to many of the other things, right? I've made a few random notes that maybe we can, that I want to talk about. You can jump in whenever you want. One is, is the standard. For me, the interim budget was largely, when I say it was a tepid affair, etc., a large part of the interim budget was just about, a report card. It was basically a lot of self praise. It was a lot of, we've done this. Indian economy and Indian society is now, it's completely at a better place because we are there, and we've done this, we've done that, we've done this, and a lot of basically talking about their own achievements. Which, I mean, maybe it's okay. It felt more like a press release rather than a budget speech, but I'm willing to kind of forgive all of those bits. What were the interesting kind of announcements though? One, we spoke about the housing bit, but I think there was a lot of sloganeering as well. Right now we had, I don't know, back in the 60s and 70s, we had Jai Jawan and Jai Kisan. Now we have two more added to that list: Jai Vigyan and Jai Annadata, and now Jai something else. What is the Anusandhan? I don't even know what that means, but
I think it is research, if I'm not
research,
wrong.
right? Yeah. So which I want to just speak about that maybe because of the research bit. So now there is, I think, a deliberate push towards building R&D in India, and we know this is one of the weak points of the Indian economy. If you just look at the number of patents per capita, if you look at the number of journals, number of peer published journal papers, if you look at number of latest cutting edge technology that's coming out of India, on all of these factors, I think we are very, very behind. We are lagging behind than most of our peers, right? And so therefore I think this was needed, that there's a push that was needed. Now, a lot of information has not come through, but at least to begin with, they're saying that we will lay down a corpus of, I think, 1 lakh crores will be established. With 50-year kind of interest-free loans, and this is meant for quote-unquote tech-savvy growth. Okay, we don't know what that means, but that's what they're saying. And I think they're also looking at some of these things, deep tech for defense purpose, etc. I think those are all the correct buzzwords. Now, of course, as you will be the first one to point out, we have to actually see how this plays out, right? How much of it is actually translates into policy outputs and outcomes. But I think that was just an interesting thing. It at least indicates that the government is interested in this, right?
Yeah. So since you are talking about a report card, I mean, yeah, this shows that they are interested. Tells you about the intentions of the government. But when we say report card, the report card tells you about what we have done in the past, right? So some of the numbers, especially the revised estimates and actual expenditures, we can look at to find out actually how the government has done. So I think when we use the term report card, we should also look at some of those things.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So now, one interesting thing that I found was related to NREGA, right? So NREGA spending has increased massively. So whatever was the budgetary allocation last time, and there was a 43% increase in the revised estimates, right? So, and this year's budgetary allocation is also same as the revised estimate. So 43% increase in NREGA. Now, on one side, the government talks about, oh, we are creating jobs and all those things, but given that you have to spend so much amount of Narega, and Narega is primarily demand driven, it shows that the rural economy is not doing well. There is somewhere sluggish demand, and it is not just the budget numbers, right? There are other reports which also point to the same thing. So it is going to be a cause of concern, and I don't know. And given that bulk of the population stays in rural areas, Narega is for rural areas. I mean, this is going to be a problem which needs to be addressed in future.
Exactly. I'm really glad that you brought that out, because there was a lot of talk about how rural incomes have actually increased. Right? I mean, a lot of talk, as in by Nirmala herself. During the budget speech, she mentioned multiple times that rural incomes have increased because that's their focus area, etc. But as you say, the fact that Narega demand has gone up is never good news for the economy. It just means, as you said, because it's demand driven, if more people, I mean, for most people, right, think about this. If most people are applying and getting the least common kind of jobs, or the lowest paying jobs, right? Because Narega only gives you 100
Yeah,
days of guaranteed employment. So if
exactly,
people are applying for that and going for that, it means that they're not finding jobs elsewhere. So at least on
exactly,
that front, on creation of jobs, we've not done well. And it definitely doesn't mean that rural incomes are increasing in that sense. So that is one factor. The other bit, and I'm going to use the same logic that you use, Sarthak, which is that, there's again a lot of talk about how crop yields are increasing and farmers are doing well, but at the same time, they're also increasing MSP. Right,
exactly.
which tells
Yeah,
me again, MSP is a government guarantee for farmers who can't sell at a higher price. So if you need to do MSP, it means that your farm and your entire agricultural sector is not doing that well,
exactly.
right?
So yeah,
Um,
that is the, I mean, that is a real concern, no?
Absolutely. And so for me, see, even in the farm sector, I think there's one or two kind of interesting factors. One, I think they're saying greater crop insurance, and I'm all for crop insurance. I think that's a far better market mechanism than just giving out. But at the same time, they also said that they're giving direct financial assistance to 11.8 crore farmers,
Yeah,
right?
that
Uh,
PM Kisan, right? The allocation is quite high, and it remains
exactly.
high.
Exactly. So that again tells me that if you need to keep giving out, and part of it is urea subsidy, part of it is something else, part of it is direct benefit transfer, a whole bunch of other things. But it just means that if the government has to allocate such large funds for farmers, then for farmers' welfare, then it means that the farmers are not doing well, right? And the disappointing thing for me in this budget was that there was no talk of the agricultural reforms. So this very government brought about some set of agricultural reforms, or tried to, in the farm laws that failed. Of course, they completely bungled up the implementation part, or even just the building political consensus. That's a talk for an entirely different day. But those farm laws were good, but there's no talk about that. So we've moved very far away from doing those absolutely required structural reforms in agriculture.
Yeah, in fact, these numbers also reflect the fact that people who are in agriculture, they are possibly not able to transition out of agriculture. They're not able to possibly move to urban areas. They're not able to move out of agriculture,
Correct.
which is
and,
again a
and
cause
that
of concern.
Correct, and part of that is interesting, because there was also mention in the budget about post-harvest incomes, right? And post-harvest income, again, the finance minister was talking about food processing, about dairy farms, and all of those things. But here's the crucial thing: you can't really build a sustainable, robust post-harvest economy unless you do land reforms, because part of that agricultural land which is no longer fertile has to be sold to, let's say, food processing units, which can come there, which can take up that thing and sell. And for that, for example, you also need FDI in single brand retail, which means you'll build complex supply chains, a whole bunch of, again, structural reforms that's required in agriculture, which is not coming through. So everything else is just very superficial.
Yeah. And apart from that, there are few buzzwords that were used in the last few years, right? Few years budget, and ministers and yeah, a lot of people in the government used to use these terms, right? Urban governments, urban transformation, smart cities.
Yeah.
So interestingly, the allocation to smart cities and urban governance, right, it has gone down. And there has been a massive decline, like 16,000 crores to 10,000 crores, right?
Oh,
So Yeah. So I don't know what is happening here. How do we explain this? But yeah, this is what is the case.
I think smart cities went out of favor from the political kind of discourse very early on, 2017, 18 itself. I think nobody started talking about smart cities. It was only in the initial first 2, 3 years. And then there was just a complete drop. Even, for example, this budget or entire thing, I don't know about the allocation, you'd probably be better, but there was no mention of Swachh Bharat.
Ha.
So that's again taken a back seat, right? Very clearly. So smart city, Swachh Bharat, all of these big initiatives that was there has taken a back seat. Now, again, luckily or this thing again, there was not the Make in India and kind of inward-looking push that also I think took a back seat. Maybe I hope so because they.
But Anupam, there were a lot of mention of PLI. I mean, the PLI is there at multiple places. So
Right, but they didn't increase. There's no at least deliberate increase in custom duties on imports. So that's the only positive I'm going to take away from all of this.
yeah,
Right?
maybe.
Uh,
Yeah. And in recent times, there has also been reduction in custom duty in some, I think, electronic components. So yeah,
yeah.
goes.
Correct. My big gripe, and I there's no way I cannot mention this, which is that there was talk about women empowerment, Nari Shakti, and all of those things. But and the finance minister also said that women labor force participation rate is increasing. But I think we have to put this in perspective. It is still one of the lowest in the world. The good news is it has actually taken a slight uptick in the last few years. And that's only because in the pandemic, it reached an all-time global low of 8%. 8% of women was in the labor force, right? That is lesser than what was in Syria.
Conflict-ridden
So
place, yeah.
Yeah, so in that sense, of course, you're going to see an uptick, but it's not enough. I mean, I think all of these claims, I'm just not sold by this idea at all. You can talk about Nari Shakti all you want, but it still remains that women labor force participation rate in India is woefully low, is abysmally low, and it's abhorrent to think of how low it is. Okay, so I just have to put that on record that I'm not convinced by this at all. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I think maybe we're going to speak about the last big thing, which is maybe one small thing before the big thing, which is on the other interesting part was on they were talking about railway modernization. And I was just interested to see that they spoke about railway corridors, that about 40,000 bogies would get an upgradation to at least Vande Bharat levels, that they would have dedicated kind of freight corridors, high traffic density corridors. I think there was a corridor for cement, steel, and I know a few other things. They said increased port connectivity. I think in general, all of these things are good. We need to be increasing the average kind of speed of our freight railway network, because right now, by the way, so in any advanced economy or even moderately advanced economy, most of the cargo transportation is done through the railway network. Whereas in India, I think it was about 60% in the 1970s and 80s, and it's now decreased to about 20%, right? So it's actually going down, and that's because of the horrible condition of our Indian railways. The average speed of a freight train is less than 25 kilometers, right? And it's a logistical nightmare if you want to load, unload cargo. It's just not working, right? So I think some genuine reforms there would be good, but I have to mention that the only way out is to start privatizing. Introduce private players into, at least you begin with the freight corridor, right? Introduce private players in the freight corridor. Indian Railways, the government entity doesn't have to own all of these things. Start running, big private networks. Railways on the existing kind of lines, and I think that some of it will be the same. The other bit, of course, Nirmala Sitharaman did mention that they were going to, upgrade tourist centers, including Lakshadweep, just so you know, because it had to be mentioned. Okay, final bit, Sarthak, and this is where you comment. Fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit was at 5.8% of GDP.
Yeah, it was 5.8. In fact, the aim was 5.9%, but it is 5.8%, the final numbers. So they have done better than what they expected, and the target is 5.1%. So it shows that the government is moving in the direction of fiscal consolidation. 2019, around that point of time, it used to be in the range of 3.4% or so, right? But during the pandemic, yeah, obviously the government had to spend more, and and it peaked to more than 6%. But yeah, I mean, we are moving in the direction of fiscal consolidation, so that's a good news.
Yeah, but generally that's good news. But I have one again problem here, which is that we're now talking about the path to fiscal consolidation finally reaches at we'll get it below 4.5%. So, Sarthak, my question to you is 4.5% the new 3?
So no, I don't. I mean, I don't know what is going around in these circles, but yeah, I mean, we should not be aiming to be at 4.5%. We should be moving in the direction of. I mean, we should further reduce the fiscal deficit.
Right. So, in many of the conversations, whether it is the economic survey, the chief economic advisor, you're looking at this thing, the big target seems to be somehow we'll reach to 4.5%. But remember that the FRBM rules and the target is actually 3%.
3%. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Because even at 4.5%, I'm afraid that you're just going to keep crowding out private investment.
Private investments. Yeah.
There's just no space for borrowing for private players. And then, and this kind of ties in with the idea that we're talking about capex and why that's good, but we have to mention here that private capex is at very low levels, right? And that's because, of course, private players cannot invest in capital expenditure because they're not having the borrowing fiscal space, right? Fiscal space for borrowing. So there are very real consequences of having high fiscal deficit, and I'm afraid, maybe part of me is happy that it's not increasing, but I'm afraid this is not enough. I think we have to. I'm a fiscal hawk. I think we have to aggressively lower the fiscal deficit to far below 4.5%, and the sooner the better.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, at least they're moving in that direction. I don't know when they are going to achieve sub 4.5% levels.
Right. Okay. So with that, I think we can close this episode and bring this conversation to a close. This is fascinating. Thank you, Sarthak, for all the insights on the budget. There are quite a few things to talk about, even in the interim budget. So I don't know if we can expect a longer episode when the actual budget comes out in July, if I'm not mistaken. So until then, thank you everybody for listening in, and cheers.
Yeah, thanks Anupam. Thanks to the audience.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.